Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review. I'm Asbed Bedrossian, and along with Hovik Manucharyan this week we're going to talk about the following topics. Kocharyan closes in on Pashinyan's lead ahead of the snap elections. Pashinyan goes to Europe.
And we have with us Asbed Kotchikian, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the American University of Armenia, and Emil Sanamyan, a Senior Research Fellow at USC's Institute of Armenian Studies, specializing in politics in the Caucasus. Hello and welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Hovik.
So we have two topics, but one of them is pretty expansive. I think we can talk for a long time about it. The regular update of the MPG polls is in. I guess they're going to do one every week until the last week of the elections, which is June 18th. So we have 2 more weeks of polling left. This one shows some interesting findings in that Kocharyan is, or the highest on Dashing to be precise, is continuing its upward bound trajectory in ratings. So it went from 17.5% to 20.6%. Meanwhile, civil contract is continuing on the downward path, going from 22.9% to slightly less than that, to 22.4%. I wanted to discuss these findings with everyone and what you see here. Prosperous Armenia went up a notch. Republic, not Republicans, but the Republic went down. I don't want to sort of read all the numbers, but I just also like to add that these numbers that we cited are based on the answers to the polling question. In reality, what most pollsters do, or what most analysts would do, is take out the population that answered "I don't know," was difficult to respond, or refused to respond, and scale the rest of the results accordingly, because most of these would not be likely voters. Emil, overall, what's your opinion on the dynamic of these polls and these results that we're getting?
Well, you already pointed out that the dynamic. Kocharyan is right now in a statistical tie with Pashinyan. And the trend, of course, is favorable to Kocharyan. At this point, I think it's legitimate to be able to predict actually an outright victory for Kocharyan, or a coalition arrangement, or at least a tie in the second round. So if you back up a little bit about this poll, I mean, it's obviously good to have this polling, any polling. And this particular pollster has sort of earned his credibility over the past few years. I think his numbers have been very close to the actual results. If we look at both 2017 and 2018 elections, they were very, very close. Of course, 2017 elections was when the Republicans, Serge Sargsyan was still in power, and 2018 is when Pashinyan was already in power. If we look at December 2018 results versus their polling, they basically predicted the numbers within 1 to 2 percentage points for all of the parties that made it into the parliament. So that's Pashinyan's party, Marukyan's party, Tsarukyan's party. So they're a credible organization as far as their sampling. Of course, we still have a couple of weeks. Things can change. This is still in progress. Things are still developing. But yeah, there's little doubt that Kocharyan is winning the election. As far as overall, I mean, it would be great to have a couple more polls that come from credible sources. Unfortunately, we don't have another pollster that does this regularly and does this publicly to be able to, cross-check results. There is the International Republican Institute sanctioned paid for poll, but they don't come out on time. Their latest poll came out almost a month after it was conducted, and of course, it was already outdated by the time it came out.
Right. One thing I need to add, Hovik, if I may, is that regarding the IRI polls, more often than not, they are actually commissioned by various organizations, by various groups, international organizations, and they usually have the first look at it way before it goes to public. And as Emil pointed out, by the time it becomes public, it becomes quite outdated. Another thing about the polls, about the polling, as much as the MPGs are reliable polling sort of service as a polling service, one of the biggest problems that I have witnessed about this, and again talking with various international and local observers, is the utilization of phone polling rather than in-person polling. In general, there is an overall trend about, or overall criticism about telephone polls and their validity and how do they reflect or the reality on the ground. So that in itself is a bit of a challenge as well. It's not a uniquely Armenia issue, but it is one of the major handicaps of any kind of a polling, telephone polling.
I think that's always almost become the standard for polling, the telephone polling, because everybody has a phone these days. There's very few segments of the population that cannot be reached by phone, right? And
Right.
in terms of finding a sample that is random enough and representative enough in terms of, I mean, different regions, different social classes, I think that's acceptable. As a matter of fact, in Armenia, I remember the first phone polling began back in before 2008 elections. I remember actually Aravot newspaper would sanction a polling, and it would be a phone-based polling in Yerevan only because they at the time the phone penetration in Armenia was still kind of patchy in the provinces, so they did the Yerevan phone polling, and it was fairly accurate, representative in terms of at the time Serge Sargsyan, Petrosyan, and others in the poll. So yes, it would be great to have, like I said, an additional pollster that would have done regular polling like this, but this particular pollster has, I think, earned its credibility. So we have a general picture of where things are shifting towards. They could still shift in a different direction, but that's where they're going right now.
Yeah,
And
and
for
one
those
thing we
that,
need to add,
yeah,
sorry, Hovik. Well, one thing we need to add back in 2008, one of the other easier ways of getting a sample, a geographically well-distributed sample, is that you might be using a landline as well. So with landline, you already know that when you're calling a number, the person is the person answering the phone is in a certain region or a certain area of the country. Whereas with a cell phone, there is also, yes, the cell phone penetration, the phone penetration is much, much higher, but also people's movements is much higher. So even if they would ask what part of the country you live in, they could be easily someone who might be coming and going to Yerevan, and their influence and their political sort of exposure to political concepts and ideas and campaigns might be also influenced by the fact that they're moving back to the capital city, or they're mostly in the region, in a village or in rural areas, and so on. So a lot to question there, a lot of ifs and buts.
In this, though, it would be where they're registered to vote rather than where they reside, right? They could be residing, working in Yerevan, but registered to vote
Right.
in in a rural area that may be an hour away or something. But the important part is where they're going to vote, and I mean, the important part is whether they're going to vote or not. I mean, it's a small country, so it's not like it's
Right.
not a federal system, right? It's a national vote.
Right.
by the way, I believe what they do is something called random digit dialing. So they just dial random phone numbers until someone picks up. And I believe that's when they ask them, where do you live and would you like to sort of participate in our poll? The response rate, it doesn't mention on this one, but from the previous ones I've observed, it's about like 20 to 30%. And remarkably, the response rate, at least for the previous polls, has not changed. Well, that's another thing that I've seen frequently mentioned in polling as a potential, caveat.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Hovik. Yeah, I mean, I heard that in both IRI and MPG polls, the response rate hasn't gone up higher than 25% respondents. And this is why it goes back again to the issue that it's much, much easier or much more reliable, if you want to call it, to have, pollsters out there, in different regions,
In
stopping
person.
people and asking questions. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And the response rate obviously would be higher, and the sampling would be much better represented. But regardless, I mean, polls are polls, right? Lies, damn lies, and statistics. You can change that and say
Yeah,
lies, damn lies, and
yeah.
polls.
Yeah, no, I mean even in the country like the United States, where you have a massive number of pollsters that are polling constantly and polling for various reasons and polling before the election. We've had a situation before, for example, the previous election, 2016, when most polls showed Clinton winning but Trump won in the end. But you could see even in the polls that showed Clinton winning that her relative support was eroding. So that the notion of regular polling, what it does give you is the trend picture, right? So it shows one candidate gaining at the expense of another. That's almost the only important thing you get out of the polling, considering, the sampling issues that are always present.
So what do you think about the following question then? They also broke down the response based on Yerevan, regional cities, so all the capitals of the different marzes, and then villages. And here there are some interesting changes as well. So previously, Hayastan Dashing led in Yerevan. In cities, they were neck and neck, and in villages, they were trailing greatly to civil contract. Now, even the tie in the regional cities is broken. So in Yerevan, Hayastan is leading 25% or 24.6% to 15.1%. So that's like almost a 10-point lead. In the cities, besides Yerevan, it's 23.4% versus 29.4%. So also a significant lead. But in villages, civil contract is leading 31.8 to 14.5%. We've talked about this before in the past and why this happens, but I wanted to ask if Emil, I guess we see top contenders visiting the regions, and I guess they're trying to maximize or minimize the opponent's vote as much as possible. What do you think are the different regional strategies of civil contract in Hayastan?
Well, if we go back in every single election cycle. We've observed this trend where the main challenger does much better in Yerevan, does better in major towns than in the rural areas. It's just the nature of the Armenian body politic, I guess, and it probably is most likely replicated in most countries like Armenia, where politics occurs in the capital. So the new trends, they're set off in the capital, and then they kind of permeate through the rural areas, and every once in a while you would still have, like, I remember back in the 90s, Armenia had this one village that the communists had hold on for many years after the fall of the communist regime, right? Then you had some areas where HHS would still be strong, and then you would have, areas where Dashnaks are still strong, etc. Even after they're no longer in power. So that is repeated every election cycle. It's not surprising that trends are set in Yerevan and then they start to permeate through major towns and then into the rural areas. Rural areas, by their very nature, very closed political systems, right? You have one village leader, and you have basically his. Everybody else kind of relies on his favoritism, right? In terms of providing, seeds, or providing fertilizer, or providing, equipment for agricultural work, etc. So,
and also media access.
And in terms of what people have access to or choose to have access to, at this point, you can live in a village and have access to any kind of information, but really, you still have kind of very orderly kind of situations in terms of most people kind of tend to delegate decisions onto, as far as who to support, and to their kind of local senior person, because the more rural you are, the more isolated you are, the more vulnerable your whole economic system is. So people just don't want to risk it in terms of who's the boss now. Yeah, that's fine. That's how usually hear from people in villages. Of course, there are many exceptions. Of course, not everybody's like that, but general picture is usually like that, with whoever is in power versus whoever the challenger is.
Is the internet available ubiquitously through the villages?
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes, it is. But so in the case of the internet, I think we talked about this in the past. The number one recommended thing that people see, or especially like I was doing the most recent tabulation, is 50% of the view traffic goes to Perfect TV and similar channels. So if you talk about the internet, then pro-government, the pro-government voice, especially fake news, unfortunately, wins. And then in the regions as well, the number one broadcaster, or the only broadcaster in most cases, is Armenian Public TV, which is also controlled by the government. So that's what I meant by media access and pro-Pashinyan sort of messages being predominant in the regions.
Hovik, there's one thing here, but also making the duality or highlighting the difference between Yerevan and the villages or rural areas or urban versus rural areas is that Yerevan itself, where almost half of the or more than half of the voters are sort of registered, is also which district of Yerevan are we getting? Unfortunately, these polls do not break it down, and I think that makes a lot of difference of the polling or the mood or the sort of the perceptions in Shengabit versus in Avan
I agree
or
with
in
you, Asbed.
Achapniak between Nubarashen. That makes a lot of difference.
It would be interesting to know which districts the votes came from.
I think most of the respondents would not even know their district, so I guess they could give their address, which would allow the pollster to tabulate. I don't know if they do that. Yeah, but you're right. That would be interesting. I talked about this last time, and the intent to vote, I just want to quickly mention it. In general, like about 55.3% said they'll definitely participate. 11.9% they'll likely participate, and then 10.6 likely no, and 20.7 definitely no, and 1.5 refused or said difficult to respond. So the question I had, which is not answered by the pollster, is whether the intent to participate would change based on region. Would be, and maybe this is what you have to pay for, and this is what all the political parties pay to see, which region is most, encouraged and discouraged to participate and work on those regions. But last time when we talked about this, Hrant Mikhailian said traditionally it is those who live in the villages who participate more readily. Do you think that the dynamic could change? Because I think that, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Hayastan Dashing's goal to increase participation in general, because that's how they would probably get a more favorable result to them, and a lower participation would help civil contract, essentially. Do you agree with that statement?
I think there's always that problem in all countries, right? I mean, in the United States, one of the things we've seen constantly is that higher participation favors the Democrats, whereas lower participation favors the Republicans. I think the dynamic here in Armenia, to understand it, it hasn't consolidated enough in the last 2-3 years to know if usually a civil contract, let's say, has a solid number or a solid amount of supporters who would turn out regardless of what they do. Or is it the Hayastan Dashing, Armenia faction or Armenia faction that actually has that? I think you're right to some extent. But then I have witnessed this in the last at least couple of weeks when going from Yerevan to the various regions, especially to the north. It's quite interesting to see that the support, Kocharyan support in general, because at the end of the day, people are voting for Kocharyan, not for the Dashing, regardless if the ARF is there or the other parties there as well. But in Gerar Kunik, in Godaik, for instance, in Dabush, in Vayotsor, definitely these are areas that, regardless of what the voter turnout would be, Kocharyan might not perform well in those. But again, that's why the focus is on Yerevan, because half of the votes are in Yerevan. And one thing I have to add also, in different conversations, and it's a sample, it's not in any way scientific, granted, but I have noticed more and more people who are actually saying that we want to participate, we want to go and vote, regardless of what. I'm just going to go and vote, even casting a blank vote, because I don't want my vote to be stolen. There is quite a large number of those there as well. So the intent to participate can only show so much. Or only so little about how the things or how the support would vary. So this is actually quite interesting for me to see how people's civic duty, if you want to call it, and their realization that their vote matters and they're not willing to sell it or exchange it has increased dramatically in the last 4, 5, 6 years.
One thing I would also point out is that we look at what the parties, the top 7, not parties, but political leaders that are in the field right now, right? Pashinyan, Kocharyan, Sarukyan, I guess Vanetsyan/Serge. Serge Sargsyan really more important than Vanetsyan in that alliance. Marukian and Aram Sargsyan. Well, Ter Bedrossian doesn't make the top 6, I think. This is the same parties that won seats in 2017 election, right? We had in 2017 we had Republicans, Bargavach, Yelk, and ARF. Now they're structured a little bit differently, but basically Yelk is split up into three. But you still have the same players in 2021 as you had in 2017. So this is one change that is observable to me in terms of in the past, prior to 2017, almost every election cycle, well, you would have some players that would be repeat players. Mostly that's Republicans, Bargavach, and the ARF. But you would always have a change in who the main opposition challenger was. So if you recall, you went from the Vazgen Manukyan-led alliance to the Demirchan-led alliance to Rafi Ovanesyan-led alliance, etc. You didn't have that change this time around because you had an opposition force come into power, right? And the formers, so to speak, were able to maintain the role of the main challenger, which was not the case in all of the prior election cycles. So that's another thing that I think. I don't know if it talks about some kind of political consolidation in terms of political preferences, but certainly, it's a reflection of the resources that an opposition that was just in government has versus an opposition that has not been in government for a while or has never been in government would have. So that's one thing that's observable in this election cycle. Basically, we have not had a third party candidate, so to speak, rise in this election cycle.
But with one caveat here is that the consolidation, as you mentioned, has been dramatic, except for Barkabachayastan. Everything else is sort of really mixed up in the election in terms of the alliances. So, for instance, you had the My Step alliance, which is now running as civil contract alone, and I think there's a reason for this because probably whatever membership they would have, the civil contract will have in the parliament, they want to make sure that they have a stronger hold on their members because otherwise in a faction it might have been more difficult for them to control any possible runaway MPs. And there's also the fact that the ARF, the first time ever in elections, has actually decided to join a coalition, a faction, probably motivated by the fact that in the previous election they didn't pass the threshold. And then of course there's the name recognition, right? You have some of these alliances. For instance, with the Badivunem sort of a faction or the electoral bloc, you have Vanetian, but you do not have any of the major Republican Party names except for Antranik, Daron Markarian, who actually is sort of not necessarily in the top Republican Party echelons. So there are so many things to analyze there. For instance, my analysis of this is that probably the Republican Party feels that they are not going to be able to make it, or they have less chances of passing the threshold, and they don't want to burn their the top leadership. That's why they actually let Vanetian take the lead, and they have no major names on the list from the party itself. Their hope is that they might end up making small kingmakers, not necessarily big kingmakers, unlike Zarukyan. So all of these are also factors in terms of making this election a bit unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, there's a bit of that.
Asbed, what do you think about the trends in the polls that we mentioned earlier? For example, when these polls and the election season started about a couple of months ago, civil contract was in the 37 to 40% range, and now it's down to 22. And just as dramatically, the highest on Dashing started barely clearing the thresholds, and now it's in the 20s. So is it the last month of events happening in Armenia, or was, let's say, the original levels fictitious?
No, I think the trends are definitely reflective of what has been happening on the border and in border infringements and by Azerbaijan and issues related to border security. But I think more importantly, especially looking at the surge of Hayastan Dashing, is the great PR machine that they have. I mean, they started campaigning without campaigning even before the official time happened. Again, in my trips, in my drives in Armenia, in the regions, I could already see at least 3 weeks ago about PR billboards of Kocharyan, and he was just quote unquote advertising his book, right? It's not campaign; it's advertising my book, and he had the chapters of each, the title of each chapter in his book as taglines and so on. But also, I've been following the PR sort of component, especially of Hayastan Dashing. They do have, I don't know who's running the PR. I mean, I'm sure there's a professional team, but the images that they are actually projecting has a big impact on the trend.
And it's omni-channel, right? It's everywhere. It's also someone told me that there is no PR company in Armenia that could do this. So they were saying that there's an outside PR firm involved. But
what is it they're doing that an Armenian company could not do? I don't understand.
Well, the question is not what is it that it's not what they're not doing. The question is that there are no well-informed or the scale. It's by itself. I mean, one of the things, if you look at, for instance, one of the billboards or one of the campaign pictures or photos that they have is the three top names on the Hayastan Dashing standing with white shirts and black pants. That's actually, it's one of the interesting things. Simple and eye-catching, but then they're actually rolling their sleeves up. So it has this element of thinking strategically. What would the image be for an average citizen when they see this? Again, I don't know it would make any significance if it's a local firm or an international firm, but knowing and following what Robert Kocharyan, the transformation of Robert Kocharyan in the last 20 years, since he came to power in 98 and the following 3 years, he hasn't been shy, and he's willing to learn, and he's willing to actually follow the instructions of the PR sort of firms for this. So I think that the trend is very much influenced by the PR machine, and on the contrary, the civil contract is relying on populism and basic, just clips here and there without much of a, comparatively speaking, without much successful PR machine. But I'm not, by saying this, I'm not undermining at all the fact that the last month or so, the border issue and security issue is one of the biggest sort of challenges that Kocharyan is better poised to tackle, at least in the minds of many people.
Yeah, there's no doubt that in terms of objective criteria, in terms of objective picture, I mean, this is just two different types of, worlds that are kind of colliding there. Kocharyan is the only leader of Armenia who actually left leadership of Armenia on his own will and managed to, kind of find a place for himself, as a board director of a major Russian / international company, right? And so actually continued to kind of do things that are professional, meeting with people regularly and sort of having to put the suit on and sort of keep in shape, so to speak. All of the other former Armenian leaders, they tend to either retire into kind of, into private life, right? Without doing anything, basically, that's publicly visible. So, and then we have, Pashinyan, a complete failure of everything you can fail at. And of course, he still represents kind of the need for the failed part of Armenian public in terms of economic failure or lack of progress in terms of need poverty, come out of poverty, etc. His promise is still there that, or at least some people still believe it, that if only he would just do a little bit more of squeezing of the reach, we would all become a little bit better off. So that promise is still there, but of course, with all this everything else happening, of course, it's the credibility of it is shattered considerably.
Emil, I have a quick question here. Some of the parties or alliances like Badivunem are barely reaching the levels of the threshold to make it into parliament. Assuming that there's a risk and they won't make it, we already know some of the difference between the leaderships of these various alliances. But why, having said how much of a priority it is to take Pashinyan out for these alliances, why is it that they cannot come together to ensure their goals?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood. Who cannot come together?
For example, the Badivunem folks, right, and the Hayastan Dashing folks. They're not terribly far apart ideologically, but there are differences between their leaderships. Why wouldn't they put those differences aside and expand their alliance?
I'm not privy to what the discussions were prior to decisions, whether, they would set up their own list or set up a block or whatever. But my hunch is that, first of all, Kocharyan, I don't think he's forgiven Serge Sargsyan for precipitating this whole, I don't want to use the S word, but basically a shitstorm that, caused by Pashinyan coming to power. So I don't think he wanted to see either Serge or any of his people in his list, or at least wouldn't offer them positions high enough on the list. So they decided to, just to go on their own, with this Vanetsyan. I mean, again, bringing Vanetsyan into this picture, it's not like Vanetsyan had any kind of rating. I mean, it shows a kind of, lack of focus on part of Serge Sargsyan, in this whole situation.
Oh, Emil, one of the things that you mentioned about Vanetsyan and Pativunem and the Republican Party and their lack of, and Kocharyan not forgiving Sargsyan about this could also explain why the top Republican Party leadership is not represented in Pativunem faction. So it is, I think, there is a lot of components there. And let's not forget, even though there is not a single party except for civil contract that supports Pashinyan at this point, maybe there might be one or two smaller ones, but at the end of the day, egos. I think there is a huge, huge component of egos and personalities. This is something that is very, very important to keep in mind. And Kocharyan is not someone who would let go, right?
Yeah, one of the interviews I saw, I didn't actually watch the whole thing, but there was an interview that Arat Tevosyan did with Armen Gilbert, who I think Armen Gilbert has sort of always been the right-hand man for Kocharyan and sort of the person he trusts to deliver results and go and, knock on the door. And,
right.
My very first impression of Armen Gilbert was, I think it was, early 2000s or maybe late 90s. When I came to Armenia, and he was running around the airport trying to make sure that the customs or other employees of the airport don't rip off passengers arriving from abroad. Armen Gilbert was delegated he was an aide to Kocharyan at the time. He was delegated to the airport to make sure this place looks a little more civilized than it was at the time.
Are you talking about the Media Max interview?
Yeah, going back to the Media Max interview, what Armen Gilbert said there is that difference between Serge Sargsyan and Robert Kocharyan. He said that Kocharyan is much more of a macro manager and Serge Sargsyan is a micromanager, kind of basically, getting into details of everything. And what is, is also kind of apparent here is that Kocharyan is, ready to accept that some things he doesn't understand very well. For example, how to run an election campaign, and would delegate it to somebody like Armen Gilbert or people that he would trust Armen Gilbert to select to deliver things that he cannot deliver himself. Like a nice picture. I don't know. Some kind of commercial, political commercial. And a contrast that to Serge Sargsyan's imagery that I still remember for 2008 elections, just the most ridiculous photos that you can come up with that were the main sort of on his website. Different level of sophistication there.
I remember seeing just one picture, and I think we should move on, but the Republicans published one picture when they were like strategizing over the campaign, and it was all the top brass. It was Vanetsyan, Serge Sargsyan, Ashotyan, and so forth. I didn't see a similar picture from Robert Kocharyan, but I would think that if there was one, it would be like one or two people from the party and like 10 different consultants. So, maybe I'm projecting here. But so quickly, Asbed, there are 26 parties or alliances running. That's a staggering number considering that each one of those has to pay 10 million AMD dram deposit. How do you explain the unprecedented number of parties in these elections?
Well, unprecedented since 2003 parliamentary elections where there were about 23, 24 parties. I think there are a couple of factors here, Hovik. First of all, probably this is going to be the most competitive election ever in Armenia because Pashinyan is weak. after the defeat, after the humiliating defeat, and his inability to manage the country afterwards or even before. So now you see that a lot of people, a lot of different political parties are seeing an opportunity that they might get into the parliament. So that's one. The other thing I think is that a lot of people, at least again, I might be projecting, as you did, Hovik, probably, is that I don't think that the current government, this is also the first time that the current government, the incumbent government, doesn't have absolute control over administrative resources to utilize. They do have some administrative resources, Pashinyan and so on, but it is not an absolute control like you would have seen under Serge Sarkisyan or Robert Kocharyan or in the last 25 years or so. So I think all of this has encouraged a lot of different political parties to throw their hat into the ring and participate. Don't forget that a lot of political parties were actually formed also. It's not just about parties participating in the elections, but also a lot of new political forces and a lot of new political parties having been created in the last 4, 5, 6 months as a reaction to the defeat, as a reaction to the war. So the political life or the political landscape in Armenia, I say, hasn't been this revamped for a long time. And also, everyone thinks that they have a fighting chance to get in. Of course, with Kocharyan's PR machine, but also his message reaching people, that is changing fast. But I would think that these are the two major reasons: the lack of administrative resources by the ruling party, as well as the overall lack of or overall increase in political interest, the need to do something. Now, if you were to look at least 15 of those parties, they don't know what they're doing. They're just running. But still, there's a need to do something, and that's, I think, the main reason why you have such an increase in number of participants.
So I just wanted to come back up to the 50,000 foot level on the polls and take stock of some of the basic facts, okay? 3 parties or blocks are comfortably clearing the threshold so far. And those are Civil Contract, Hayastan Dashing, and Bargavaj Hayastan or Prosperous Armenia. Now, Bati Vunem, in which the Republican Party is participating in, and Bright Armenia are not too far from the threshold. So the threshold from Bati Vunem being 7% and Bright Armenia being 5%, respectively. The others are far behind. So the question that I wanted to ask is, Emil, do you think that these are going to be the top main contenders, or basically is it too early to rule out other parties, or do you think there could be drastic changes that prop up or help produce a potential dark horse candidate? And if so, who do you think has a chance to catch up?
Well, like I said, what's different between this election versus the others is that in others we would always have sort of a new force rise and contend, if not for the top couple of spots, not top to 1, 2, 3, but to make it into parliament. I think that's still possible this time around. If we look at some of the other elections previously, for example, Gurgen Arsenyan, who is now running on the civil contract, is a businessman who is running on a civil contract list. I think he's number 10. Gurgen Arsenyan managed to buy off just enough votes back in, I think it was 1999 election and also 2003 parliamentary election. He made just like a businessman calculation. How many votes do you need to get to that 5% threshold? And he would just, invest just enough in a particular area or particular areas to be able to generate that support without even massive PR campaign or anything, and managed to sort of squeak into the parliament and create the parliamentary faction. You might have players like that, but I'm not sure if they have that level of ability to calculate. For example, this Tigran Arzakansian, who is a former, I think, owner of the YEREVAN, one of the brandy companies in Armenia. I forget the name. Great Valley, yeah. He's sort of invested money into Aram Gaspari Sargsyan's party and trying to it's not, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that something like that would happen, and a party like that would get into the parliament with just crossing the threshold. But like I said, you need to have a little bit of ability to both have the resources and being able to deliver that sufficient result at the polls to be able to squeak in. But I think that's the extent of the surprises that we should expect. The major preferences seem to be built in.
And last question before we move on. A lot of the political calculations now focus on, potential post-electoral alliances, because it looks like none of the candidates so far has the capacity to get the majority required for the based on law, which is 50% plus one. So the biggest question I have is whether if Prosperous Armenia and Hayastan Dashing both clear the elections, is there any question that they would not form a coalition? Because if that is the case, then most scenarios where, of the potential shape of the future parliament would probably rely on whether Hayastan and Prosperous Armenia would form a coalition.
I would defer this to Asbed. Asbed, if you maybe more fresh in terms of reading of the electoral law, what would happen if there is no clear victor and there is no majority created? What would happen with the second round?
Well, before you get to the second round, there are 6 days in which during which they can make a coalition. Now, based on Hovik's question, if Prosperous Armenia decides to throw its weight and be kingmaker, Zarukyan decides to be kingmaker with for either one, but I doubt that he will do it with civil contract. Then there is no need for a second round. Again, it all depends on the number of other parties there. Now, if none of those happens within 6 days, new elections would take place, I think, by mid to late July, in which case the top 2 parties would run for seats, and they will be allocated seats so that they can get either one of them gets a comfortable, stable majority, which is not 51%, rather 54%. Also, don't forget that here we also have a weird system of allocating the seats for national minorities, 4 seats. That could make it or break it. And as of now, civil contract is in a better position to get those seats than the highest on Dashing.
And how are those seats allocated? Just directly proportionate to the vote results? So, for example, if it's 40 and 40, then the 2 top parties split those minority seats, or what?
No, it all depends on the list. If the candidates or if the parties have minority candidates on their list, and where do they fall on the list? So, for instance, if a civil contract would get, let's say, 40 seats, and for instance, the Yazidi representative or the Assyrian representative is 50th and 52nd, they automatically receive those. So automatically, the 40% sort of is translated into, let's say, 42% by adding those. So it's a bit of a convoluted system. In terms of the electoral code.
Asbed, and what's the advantage that civil contract has in this case?
Well, they have nominated actually the names on the names of 3 minorities, except the Russian one. They have 4 minorities nominated on their list, whereas the highest on Dashing has only a Russian representative, or a representative of the Russian minority on their list. So that's the advantage that they have.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's an oversight right there for Hayastan.
Yeah, this is a system that, the former regime, especially David Harutyunyan, the former Minister of Justice, it was his brainchild to come up with this system. And obviously it was made on, mail order, if you want to call it, sort of delivery for an electoral system that would favor the incumbents or favor the party that has the administrative resources to win a majority or a plurality of the votes. And of course, that wasn't put in service or put in place as much for the benefit of the Republican Party as much as it was for the civil contract or My Step alliance. So within this context, I think, the thing is that no leader, at least everyone has explicitly mentioned that they are not going to go into a coalition with Pashinyan. So Pashinyan's only chance now, or 2 options, either to win outright in the first round and have enough comfortable majority, or go into the second, or hope that in the first round there aren't enough coalition partners against him. In which case he will go to the second round, and then he will be fighting tooth and nail for a majority.
So let's move on to the other topic of our show today, which is Pashinyan's trip to Europe. Earlier this week, Pashinyan made a 2-day trip to Paris and Brussels, where he met with the French President Macron and European Council President Michel, among others. Emil, what's your take on the timing of this visit and the issues discussed with the European officials?
No, it's just a typical pre-election campaigning by Armenian leaders. If we look at in the past, they would always try to both actually the leaders of Armenia or incumbent leaders and sort of government like Serge Sargsyan, others to try to visit major capitals prior to the elections, especially major European, and also Moscow, right? Even with the opposition candidates, Leon Bedrossian went to Moscow just prior to the election, I think, and Rafi Ovanesyan did that, I think, just after the vote, or maybe just before, I can't remember. But yeah, there's going to be, I think, it's supposed to be another visit to Moscow, or at least that's the plan to get there. And another thing that is a little bit different is that, of course, the Armenian candidates would, in the past, say, since 2008 especially, they would visit Artsakh, right, to sort of take pictures. So far, I think the only leader that visited Artsakh in recent months, well, today I saw a picture from Vanetsyan, and I think Tsarukyan visited a little bit earlier, but neither Kocharyan nor Pashinyan have visited. So it'll be interesting to see if they go to Artsakh or not.
And Vehapar Karekin.
Well, he's not running in the election, right?
That we know of.
That we know of.
Asbed Kotchikian, do you think France or the EU have anything to offer diplomatically or on the ground or anything to Armenia at this point, especially taking into consideration the call for Pashinyan to bring OSCE monitors to the Armenian-Azerbaijani border?
Yeah, well, the short answer is no. Although in a meeting with the French Senate President, Gérard Larcher, afterwards, Larcher actually called for more OSCE involvement and called the usual jazz with territorial integrity of Armenia, return of POWs, cultural protection of cultural sites, and so on. But I don't think that the OSCE, I think, is not necessarily in a good position these days. And I think it has become more and more irrelevant or less relevant, depends how you look at it. But Pashinyan's visit, I mean, the meeting with Macron, the meeting with the president of Senate, meeting with the mayor of Paris and inviting her to come to Yerevan and so on, are sort of, I think, as Emil mentioned, these are like PR components to boost his support, especially those among his supporters who are not necessarily pro-Russian. And the key point, actually, that in his visit to Brussels and after the meeting with also the Belgian Prime Minister, Alexander De Croo, he also met with the Charles Michel, the President of the European Council. And the main issue there, surprisingly, as if they're living in a parallel universe, is the issue of EU-Armenia comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement within the European neighborhood policy that, yeah, we support Armenia in its continued reform in the justice sector, this and that. So it was more lip service, and I'm not sure if the statement... Yeah, and I'm not sure if the statements that they're making, all these leaders, is something that supports Pashinyan. I mean, obviously, you can always put a twist on it and present it that, oh, Europe is going to come to save us and so on. But the European politicians, or usually diplomats and world leaders, when it comes to these issues, they explicitly try to stay away from endorsing one candidate over the other. Of course, Trump broke that mold in the past, but he was an anomaly. But they're quite careful. They're quite careful not to in any way support one candidate over the other, and they're remaining within the larger parameters of judicial reforms, governance, this and that. And within that context, they're going to be willing to work with whoever is going to come next. And their concern is not to anger any side, so that not to push, if in the event of Kocharyan winning, not to push him more into the Russian fold, or rather, to keep doors open and communication open with future cooperation.
I would point out that the Russians' position has also been very similar in the sense that they don't want to get involved into, picking favorites in terms of who's going to win the election. Like it's clear that Putin has made clear that, it's his body, body is Kocharyan. Pashinyan is not his body. but he's not overstepping that line where he's playing Kocharyan, openly supporting Kocharyan in this election, or like Lavrov visiting. There is no meeting with Kocharyan. There is no call with Kocharyan. Kocharyan is proving that he has support domestically to Putin as well, because I think that was a question for Putin. Does Kocharyan have domestic support? And he's proving that right now. So that's very important aspect of this.
Russia has signaled that basically whoever comes on board, the agreement is the agreement. It has to be fulfilled.
Right. I was going to say that. I mean, Putin's non-involvement, quote unquote, is that he knows that whoever's going to be coming in, he's going to have some kind of a control or some kind of a very close working relationship with them. I mean, if it's Pashinyan, it's going to be more in terms of having him from his polls. If it's Kocharyan, he's like the trusted ally or the trusted sort of protege, if you want to call it.
No, not protege, not protege. That's the Kocharyan is not Putin's protege. That's very clear. History is there to be consulted. Kocharyan became president of Armenia before Putin was in the picture as a national figure in Russia. So
I'm talking about the current circumstances.
Even in the current circumstances, Putin, yes, of course, made clear his position. That he thought it was wrong to jail Kocharyan, but he didn't go out of his way to free Kocharyan, right? He offered sort of to Kocharyan to come to Russia to avoid jail, but, Kocharyan preferred to stay in jail rather than go to Russia. So that, signifies a different sort of relationship there. But anyway, what I would point out also is that if Kocharyan wins this election, Armenia will catch up with Georgia in terms of having a sitting government, not re-elected, right? Because Saakashvili lost his election to Ivanishvili after losing the war in 2008. So that would sort of be surprisingly a step in the direction of Armenia developing these mechanisms, not necessarily wholly democratic mechanisms, but at least mechanisms for changing a failed leader, right? And not just the way it happened in 2018, but also through election as now.
Interestingly, Ilham Aliyev has more to bring to the table during these elections than others, but not in the way that he thinks or he was hoping the outcome would be.
I don't know what he's hoping for. I mean, he's got so much that he didn't deserve,
Right, but I think that his preference is generally to have a very weak Pashinyan back re-elected, but everything he's done has strengthened Kocharyan's hand.
I think it's not about just weak Pashinyan, just Pashinyan. I think at this point would be good because by default he's weak.
Yeah. I mean, from Aliyev's perspective, they are, they're in Shushi. That's like I don't think he ever imagined that.
Right. Absolutely.
I have to mention here that, earlier when we were talking about elections, but more also related to this is that I can't help but sort of quote, allegedly a quote by Vyacheslav Molotov, the former Soviet foreign minister. And if I'm not mistaken, in 1950s at a conference, he said, the trouble with free election is that you never know how they're going to turn out. So I think the Russians have let the elections take their course in Armenia without interference. They don't need to, because at the end of the day, whatever their elections are going to yield, they know that they are going to remain or retain their dominant role in Armenian politics, either through Karabakh, their presence in Nagorno-Karabakh, or in terms of close ties with Armenian leadership.
Yeah, and you have to look at some of the other, like most of the Russian allied states, of course, don't really have competitive elections, Belarus or, Central Asian states. But if you look at Abkhazia and even South Ossetia, which are, of course, quasi-states, but they are Russian allies in a sense, Russian dependencies, they are known to have fairly boisterous and, unpredictable elections. And we've had a couple of cases already where, you would be some clashes after the elections and the Russians would try to mediate and try to settle things, and the things would get settled eventually. But basically, that may be a reflection of how Russia deals with allies that do have some lack of monolithic politics, like one leader states. So that's, and of course, Kyrgyzstan is another example that sort of challenges that overall one man rule situation.
Interesting. There's so much more we can talk about, but we'll have to leave it here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes our program for this Week in Review episode. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from the previous week. We look forward to your feedback and your suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at groong.org or on our Facebook page ANN-Groong or in our Facebook group Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like our pages, and follow us on social media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.